Imagine this. It's September 1939. You're a young woman standing at the doorway of your small London flat. The morning paper says one word in letters 2 inches tall: war. You look up at the gray sky and you can almost feel it, a change in the air. Within a year, your street will be hit by bombs. Your brothers will be gone, and you will be doing things no woman in your family has ever done. You don't know it yet, but you're about to become the backbone of a nation.
This morning, the British ambassador in Berlin handed the German government a final note. I have to tell you now that no such undertaking has been received, and that consequently, this country is at war with Germany.
It was Sunday, September 3rd, 1939. Britain was at war again. In the quiet kitchens and narrow streets of London, Birmingham, and Liverpool, women looked at each other, mothers, wives, daughters, and asked the same question: what now? For Americans listening today, it's hard to imagine the shock. Britain was still healing from the scars of the First World War. Many had lost fathers and brothers barely 20 years earlier. Now their sons would go. But as the men marched off to join the fight, another kind of army began to form, one made almost entirely of women. By the end of that first week, more than 500,000 British women had registered for wartime service. They volunteered to drive ambulances, to roll bandages, to take jobs that no woman had held before. The government created new corps, the Auxiliary Territorial Service, the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, and the Women's Royal Naval Service. Their names sounded formal, even polite, but behind those tidy titles was a quiet revolution. Women were about to step into the heart of a man's world, and they would change it forever. The first challenge was simply survival. Within weeks, German planes began their bombing runs, what history would call the Blitz. More than 1 million children were evacuated from London, sent to strangers in the countryside. Mothers packed small suitcases with labels around their children's necks like luggage tags, praying they'd see them again soon. The women who stayed behind became the guardians of the home front. They managed the blackouts, taped the windows, and learned to sleep in underground stations. They queued for food, rationed every ounce of sugar and tea, and found small ways to keep life normal. A birthday cake made of carrots, a smile in the morning despite the rubble outside. These weren't acts of heroism, as the newspapers would tell it. They were acts of endurance. By 1940, Britain was facing a labor crisis. With so many men away, factories fell silent until women walked through their gates. In overalls and scarves, they took up tools, rivet guns, and welding torches. They built tanks, bullets, and aircraft, thousands of them. Historians estimate that by the middle of the war, women made up nearly half of Britain's industrial workforce. One of them later said, "The first time I saw a Spitfire take off, I thought, that's my work up there." It wasn't glamorous. The work was loud, dirty, and dangerous. But in those noisy factories, a new kind of pride was born. For the first time, women saw themselves not as helpers, but as builders of victory. In London, clerical workers filled endless forms for the Ministry of War Transport. Others became plotters, tracking enemy aircraft on vast maps inside underground bunkers. Some worked night after night as fire watchers, perched on rooftops to spot incendiary bombs. It was cold, it was frightening, and still they went on. Churchill himself would later say, "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few." He was speaking of the Royal Air Force, but those few could not have flown a single plane without the women who kept the engines running, the radios tuned, and the supplies moving. For women, the war meant stepping into roles that had been off-limits just months before. They became bus drivers, postal workers, police constables, mechanics. The uniforms itched. The pay was lower than men's, but few complained. In one survey from 1941, 9 out of 10 British women said they were proud to be working for the war effort. It wasn't just about duty. For many, it was the first taste of independence, the first wage they'd ever earned on their own. One woman, a factory worker named Elsie, later recalled, "Before the war, I'd never been outside my village. Then I was operating a crane in Glasgow. I was terrified, and I was free." Freedom had a price. The air raids came almost nightly. When the sirens sounded, women stopped their machines, grabbed tin helmets, and ran for cover. Some went home to find their streets gone, their windows blown out, their families safe only by chance. Still, the next morning they went back to work. There was always more to do. During the Blitz, more than 43,000 civilians were killed, half of them women and children. Yet morale never broke. In diaries, you find the same words again and again: "We must carry on." To American listeners, this may sound like something distant, another time, another country. But the women of Britain were living through what would soon touch every family on both sides of the Atlantic. And when the United States entered the war 2 years later, American women would follow a similar path, in uniforms, in factories, and in quiet acts of courage. That's why this story matters, because it's not only British history, it's human history. By late 1941, Britain was still standing, battered but unbroken, and much of that strength came from women who never fired a gun. They held the country together with their hands, their hearts, and their sheer willpower. They became the steel behind the slogan, "Keep calm and carry on." Next time, we'll follow them into uniform, into the Army, the Air Force, and the Navy, where they faced dangers no less real than those on the battlefield. This was The Women Who Kept Britain Standing, Part 1. The Day Everything Changed.
When the war entered its second year, Britain began to live by a new rhythm. It was measured not in days or weeks, but in shortages, ration books, and the distant sound of guns. The government called it the home front, but for millions of women, it was not a slogan, it was their world. Everyday life became a campaign of quiet resistance. There was no front line, no medals, but the struggle was real. Coal was scarce, soap was rationed, clothes were patched and sewn again. Housewives became engineers of survival, turning scraps into meals and imagination into comfort. Cooking itself became an act of patriotism. Radio programs shared recipes for potato pies instead of meat, powdered eggs instead of real ones, carrot jam instead of fruit. The Ministry of Food encouraged women to make do and mend, and they did. They kept their families fed, and they did it with dignity, even when the shelves were bare. In towns scarred by bombing, women formed neighborhood watch groups. They shared candles, blankets, and courage. When a house was hit, it was women who came first, bringing tea, bandages, and a steady hand on a trembling shoulder. They didn't call it heroism. They called it being British. The war also changed where women lived and how they worked. Many left the cities to join the Women's Land Army, the Land Girls. They were young, often from towns, unused to mud or early mornings. But Britain needed food as much as it needed bullets. Land girls milked cows at dawn, mended fences, and drove tractors through the countryside. They wore heavy boots and scarves tied against the wind.
Most had never seen a farm before, but they learned quickly, and within a year, Britain's farms were producing nearly as much as before the war. A farmer once said, "They came with soft hands and city shoes. They left with calluses and confidence." For many land girls, those years were the freest of their lives. Hard work, yes, but under open skies and with purpose in every sunrise. Back in the cities, transformation was everywhere. The streets filled with uniforms, khaki, navy blue, and gray. Women directed traffic in the blackout. They repaired trolley lines. They climbed ladders to hang air raid sirens. Old ideas of what women could or could not do simply disappeared. By 1942, women were driving buses, operating cranes, and loading ammunition trains. They handled explosives in factories that never slept. Accidents were common. Some paid with their lives. But production never stopped. Each shell, each bullet, each airplane wing carried fingerprints that told their story. Factories became their own front line, noisy, hot, alive with energy. Women there learned to laugh through exhaustion, to swear like soldiers, and to find friendship in the rhythm of machines. At night, they washed the grease from their hands and went dancing in the shelters. Music and laughter echoed under the ground, proof that the human spirit could not be bombed. Even during air raids, London found ways to smile. Theaters reopened. Concerts were played in subway tunnels. Fashion shows were held in basements. As long as they could sing, they were still alive. For Americans listening now, it may sound impossible. Laughter in the middle of war, but it was one of Britain's secrets of endurance. Humor became a weapon. Jokes about rationing filled the newspapers. Pets were named after generals, and women used wit to survive uncertainty. A nurse wrote in her diary, "Last night, 3 raids and no sleep. This morning, someone found lipstick in the rubble and said, 'Well, at least that survived.' We laughed until we cried." But laughter couldn't hide the cost. Women carried grief quietly. They received the telegrams. They dug through rubble for what was left of their homes. They buried the dead and then went back to work. Even in mourning, they built new communities. Church circles, sewing groups, volunteer clubs, part comfort, part therapy. They knitted socks for soldiers, wrote letters to prisoners, and took in orphaned evacuees. Every act of care was a declaration, we are still human. The war blurred class lines. In the shelters, duchesses and shopgirls slept side by side. On the factory floor, a woman from the East End could supervise men twice her age. Effort mattered more than accent. It wasn't full equality, but it was a beginning. The phrase, "doing one's bit," captured the spirit of the time. Everyone believed they were part of something larger. Women didn't wait for recognition. They worked because it had to be done. And in doing so, they reshaped society. One woman later said, "Before the war, I was shy. After the war, I could talk to anyone. Once you've faced fire, a boardroom doesn't scare you." By 1943, the home front had become a symbol of British endurance. The American press noticed. Life magazine wrote about the women who keep Britain running. The world saw quiet strength in their eyes. As victory drew closer, one question remained. Would peace let them keep the ground they had won? For now, there was still a war to finish. And soon these same women would be called to serve in uniform, beside the men, on airfields and in code rooms, facing dangers every bit as real. They had already proven their courage. Now they would prove their valor. This was the women who kept Britain standing. By 1942, Britain's women were no longer just holding the line at home. They were wearing uniforms, they were saluting officers, and they were serving their country in ways once thought impossible. For the first time in British history, women were officially part of the armed forces. They joined the Auxiliary Territorial Service, the ATS, the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, the WAAF, and the Women's Royal Naval Service, the WRENS. To outsiders, those names sounded bureaucratic, but inside the ranks, they meant purpose, pride, and danger. For many, the journey began with a train ticket and a quiet goodbye. Young women from small towns boarded trains to distant barracks. Training was harsh. Early mornings, heavy boots, endless drills. Yet laughter filled the gaps between orders. Letters were shared, songs were sung, and friendships formed that would last a lifetime. In the ATS, women became drivers, clerks, mechanics, and anti-aircraft spotters. At first, they were not allowed to fire the guns, only to aim them. But war is a practical teacher. Soon they did everything except pull the trigger. Many stood on cold rooftops through the night tracking enemy planes. One of them later said, "We used to pretend we were brave. Then one night we realized we actually were." In the WAAF, women served on airfields across the country. They were radar operators, meteorologists, and plotters in operations rooms. When bomber crews took off into the dark, these women followed their paths on maps and screens, whispering coordinates into headsets. Their calm voices guided the airmen home. One young officer remembered standing on a runway after a night raid. She looked up at the sky, streaked with vapor trails, and thought, "Men in the air, women on the ground, the same moon above us all." The WRENS, the Women's Royal Naval Service, served at ports and bases across the coast. They handled navigation charts, coded signals, and directed ship movements. Some even crewed small boats, ferrying supplies through dangerous waters. One naval commander later admitted, "My WRENS worked harder and complained less than most of my men." Uniforms changed everything. They erased the boundaries of class and background. A duchess and a factory worker might share a bunk, clean the same floors, and laugh at the same jokes. In wartime, rank mattered more than birth. For many women, that was a revelation and a kind of liberation. Outside the official services, there were the pilots of the Air Transport Auxiliary. They were civilian women who ferried new aircraft from factories to airfields. They flew alone, without weapons or radios, often through fog and enemy patrols. One of them, a young woman named Maureen, delivered more than 700 planes. She later said, "I was never afraid of flying. I was afraid of not being needed." It wasn't just about flying or driving or decoding. It was about belonging to something greater than themselves. The war gave women a new identity, one built on skill, courage, and discipline. But service had a price. Hundreds of women in uniform were killed during the war, by bombs, by accidents, by chance. Their barracks were not safe. Their convoys were targets. And when they wrote home, they left out the fear, ending each letter with "All is well." Such letters survive. One reads, "Dearest Mum, don't worry. I saw the bombers last night. We counted 70. It was like a parade in the sky." That same night, her station was hit. She didn't survive. Her mother kept that letter for the rest of her life. Such stories were never rare. They were simply untold. Britain needed strength, not sorrow. So the women straightened their caps, wiped their eyes, and went back to work. Their competence amazed even the generals. By 1944, it was clear the British war machine could not function without women. They decoded messages, tracked fleets, fueled planes across Europe. They were the quiet rhythm that kept the war moving forward. An American journalist visiting London in 1944 wrote, "These women are the calm in the storm. They work with the efficiency of soldiers and the grace of mothers." He was right. They were the living proof that resilience and grace can coexist. For many, service was also a personal awakening. They had seen the world and realized how large it was. They had met people from every corner of Britain, from every walk of life. Some found love. Others found confidence. Most found freedom. When victory finally came and orders told them to go home, many hesitated. Peace, they realized, might feel smaller than the world they had helped to save. They had changed, and so had Britain. One veteran later said, "We didn't set out to make history. We just did what had to be done. But afterward, nothing in the world looked the same." By the spring of 1945, their work was almost done. The uniforms were worn, the faces older, but the spirit unbroken. They had become the face of British endurance, strong, steady, and quietly proud. When the news of victory reached London, crowds filled the streets, and among the cheering faces were the women in uniform, the Wrens, the WAAFs, the ATS Pearls, smiling through tears, knowing they had earned that peace. Soon they would take off their uniforms and fade back into ordinary life. But their story, though quiet, would outlast the war itself. They had changed what it meant to serve and what it meant to be a woman.
By 1944, the war was reaching its final and most dangerous stage. Europe was still under occupation. Every night, the skies above Britain filled with planes heading east. On the surface, life seemed organized. Uniforms, discipline, ration books. But beneath that order was another, quieter battle. A secret war fought in code, in silence, and in the shadows. This was the hidden front, and many of its heroes were women. At a quiet estate called Bletchley Park, north of London, thousands of women worked behind locked doors decoding the enemy's messages. They sat at long wooden tables surrounded by machines, turning streams of meaningless letters into vital intelligence. Most were young. Many had studied languages or mathematics before the war. They were chosen for their patience, their sharp minds, and their ability to keep secrets. They were told, "Tell no one what you do, not your friends, not even your family." And they obeyed. For decades after the war, they said nothing. One of them, Joan Clark, worked alongside Alan Turing on breaking the Enigma code. She later said, "We didn't think of it as brilliance, it was just our job, and it mattered." And it did. Historians now believe that the code breakers at Bletchley Park shortened the war by nearly 2 years. Far beyond those quiet rooms, other women were fighting a different kind of war. They belonged to the Special Operations Executive, known simply as the SOE. Their mission was sabotage, resistance, and espionage. They were dropped into occupied Europe by parachute, carrying forged documents, radios, and courage. They lived under false names, never knowing if each knock on the door would be their last. One of them was Violet Sabo, a young mother whose husband had been killed in battle. Fluent in French, she led sabotage missions behind enemy lines. She was captured, and executed at just 23 years old. Her last words were, "I have always wanted to do my duty." Another was Noor Inayat Khan, a gentlewoman of Indian descent and a writer of children's stories before the war. She became Britain's first female radio operator sent into occupied France. For months, she transmitted coded messages to London under constant danger. Even when captured and tortured, she refused to reveal a single name. Her final word, shouted before her death, was liberty. These women fought with courage few could imagine. Their names were hidden for years, their deeds known only to history. They asked for nothing in return, not even remembrance. Not all who fought in the shadows carried weapons or radios. In field hospitals across Europe, British nurses worked around the clock, treating soldiers fresh from the front. They heard the sounds of liberation and the cries of its cost. When Germany finally surrendered in May 1945, Britain erupted in celebration. After 6 years of darkness, the lights came on again. People danced in the streets. Strangers hugged and sang. Joy and exhaustion mingled in the air. But beneath the cheers, another question lingered. What now? For women, the answer was complicated. They had driven trucks, flown planes, decoded messages, and led men. They had proven themselves capable of anything. And yet, as peace returned, many were told to go home, to make way for the men returning from war. Some did, grateful for rest. Others struggled to adjust. They had lived with purpose, and the quiet of peacetime felt too still. One former AAF wrote, "The silence after the war was the hardest part. We had been part of something bigger than ourselves, and suddenly it was gone." Britain was changing slowly but surely. The war had redrawn the map of possibility. Women could no longer be told what they could or couldn't do. The world had seen too much proof to the contrary. Many went on to become teachers, doctors, scientists, and politicians. The confidence they gained in wartime became the foundation of a new society. Their service had shown that equality was not a theory, it was earned in action. Across the Atlantic, Americans recognized the same truth. Their own mothers, sisters, and wives had filled factories and shipyards. Two nations, bound by war, had shared a single discovery: that courage has no gender. For decades, the women of Britain spoke little about what they had done. They raised children, tended gardens, and kept their medals tucked away. But when asked late in life whether they would do it all again, most smiled and said, "Of course we would." Time softened the noise of war, but not its lessons. Their generation proved that heroism doesn't always wear a uniform. Sometimes it wears an apron, sometimes a headset, sometimes just a steady heart. They showed that strength is not the absence of fear, it's the will to keep going in spite of it. They built victory from the ordinary and found greatness in endurance. Today, most of them are gone, but if you walk through London on a gray morning, you can still feel them, in the calm, in the resilience, in the quiet pride of a nation that refused to break. They were ordinary women who did extraordinary things. They never asked for glory. They only wanted peace. And in the end, that was the victory they earned.